Welcome to the second video lecture for our week on behaviorism and materialism. In this lecture, we will discuss Gilbert Ryall's article, Descartes Myth. So one thing I didn't mention from chapter 2 in our introductory textbook is that there was something called the linguistic turn in contemporary analytic philosophy in the early to mid 20th century. If you're not familiar with the history of Western philosophy, we say that the modern era begins around the time of Descartes with the industrial and scientific revolutions. And as time progressed, we had all sorts of branching off of ideas and theories, but some are particularly categorized into a split right at the beginning of the 20th century between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. We're going to be studying analytic philosophy for the most part, save a couple of authors we look at toward the end of the semester. And of course, there are many philosophers and theories that can't be easily categorized, but there is a somewhat big difference between what we traditionally talk of as analytic and as continental. So analytic philosophy has developed logical analytical methods throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, whereas continental philosophy is often thought of as more of a field of social critique. Now, analytic philosophers in the early 20th century are thinking of ways to become rigorous materialists, rigorous empiricists, and since we can't access the mind, it's private, it's what we have as our stream of consciousness or our experience, and we want to be true, honest, empiricist materialists, we can't access the mind, so we can't study it in the ways that we have been. Now, of course, the mind has been a major focus of Western philosophy for its entire existence, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So that must mean we need a radical shifting of the methods and objectives of the way we do philosophy if we really, really commit ourselves to materialism. One of the tools that they developed over the decades to do so is called conceptual analysis. So this is where we look at the problems that we're interested in, like free will or morality, right and wrong, knowledge itself, what meaning is and what mind is, and we analyze the concepts surrounding them to hopefully get to the truth of those ideas. And we can analyze them conceptually in a lot of different ways. We can think about what's necessary and sufficient for something to count as free will or as knowledge or as meaning. We can consider the logical connections between the concepts that we're studying, how one of them might cause another one or be the effect of another. And that's what our author today is going to do with the concept of mind itself. Gilbert Ryall was a British philosopher who was most active in the mid-20th century, so 1950s or so. I think our paper and his book was published in 1949. And he says that the mind-body split, however persistent it's been for a long time, was a conceptual or logical error. We made a mistake in the way that we categorize mind. So part of language, part of the things that as behaviorists we can actually study is language. And part of language is how we categorize the world around us. Now, if they exist in a certain way and we categorize them in a different way, we have made an error in our logic. And that's what he calls a category mistake. And when we are Cartesian dualists who think that the mind is immaterial and the body is material, we've done this. We've made a logical mistake. The Ghost in the Machine, this first chapter in his book, is sometimes called, because if you are a Cartesian dualist, you think of the mind as something quote unquote ghostly, somehow magically connected to our physical bodies and controlling the physical operations and actions of those bodies. But it isn't easy to see how something that's not in time or space, or at least space, could do this controlling of a material body. And the first problem that comes up immediately is that we often conceive of mind as inner and body as outer. So outer are the behaviors that are accessible to us, all the familiar things and objects in space. Somehow mind is inner. But if you are an immaterialist, if you are a dualist, then there is no such thing as inner or outer. Because if you're not in space, you have no dimension, you have no particles, you have no mass or weight. There's no such thing as inner for something that is outside of space altogether. Yet somehow, when we feel hungry, we mechanically operate our bodies to go get food and fix that. But it isn't easy to see how something completely outside of space could influence us in this way. And most of us would say that desires are a part of our mind. But Ryall says it's understandable how this confusion arose. First, we have zero access to other people's minds. We can't see their thoughts, we can't see their memories, we can't feel their feelings. Whenever we want to change something in the world, or if we want to change someone else's mind, we have to act in the bodily world. And we can only hope that it reaches their quote-unquote inner minds. But we also, too, have immediate access to our own minds. Nothing is realer than the experience we feel, the experience of our minds that we feel. We can recall our memories, we feel pain, we feel hunger, and that seems like it has to be an entity, whether or not it's in the world. So where is this category or logical mistake? And in the section, The Absurdity of the Official Doctrine, Ryall gives us a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine someone who's not familiar with post-secondary education coming to take a tour of campus. I have the map of Lehman right over there. And you can show them all of the halls where people take classes, people's offices, the scientific laboratories, the cafeteria, the athletic fields, the quad. And you can imagine at the end of this tour, the person you're giving the tour to turns and says, "But where is the university?" And that's where they said you've made a category mistake. Because they're thinking that the university, quote unquote, should be another building or space on this tour. Whereas instead, the university is the entire organization of the buildings and social activities that go on within and around them. It's a way of organizing life, or a way of organizing the materials that you see when you tour the campus. Ryall notes that there are multiple ways to exist. It doesn't have to be material and immaterial. Just stay within the realm of space, and you can think of many different ways that things exist. If you're holding an apple, a physical object, it exists in front of you. But the idea of justice also exists, in that we say it should be fairness or equal opportunity for everybody. And that in itself is different to a social institution like a university or the courts of law. The idea of justice might be a part of the courts of law, but so are the actual buildings and the lawyers that are within them, and the legal precedent that all the lawyers and judges have to know. Again, it's the physical buildings and the social activity that surrounds it. And that even contrasts with another way of existing, like a fictional entity. let's say the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. And that there's yet another way of existing when you talk about mind categories like the feeling of happiness. So sometimes we might pick a specific entity and sort it into the wrong kind of existence. And Ryall says mind is one in which we've done that. It's a logical error and it's a function of our language. So if you're a dualist, yes, the mind exists in a different way to the body, but we don't need to posit an immaterial realm. We can just say that mind is material, but it exists materially in a different way. Instead of being a separate room in our heads with the ghost that is our mind, it can instead be the organization and functionality of the complex body acting. And what is the complex body acting? In space and in time, it's behavior. So therefore, mind is the set of activities that we do because of the particular way our bodies are sophisticatedly organized. And we can then study it. We can study behavior, we can study linguistics, and we can study our concepts, and we will be studying mind. Now, I've mentioned previously that this is only the introduction to a much larger work. Ryall published a book in 1949 called The Concept of Mind. And this is where he's setting up his thesis, or the thing he's trying to prove. And one of the ways he says that he'll do that is that commonsensically in the everyday world, when we interact behaviorally with one another, we understand mind intuitively, at least in a lot of ways. We understand when someone is acting rationally or irrationally. We just know. It's not difficult to see when someone is responding appropriately to the environments around them and when one is not. If you tell someone that you want Thai food for lunch and they start crying, you know that they're not reacting rationally. It's commonsensical in a lot of ways. So instead of trying to reduce what we do to some abstract entity that we're positing over and above what we can observe, remember back to that Occam's razor, we're saying mind has to be this abstract logical entity that explains internal experience, when in reality, our behaviors explain mind just fine. All we have to do is analyze them. Furthermore, we're not observing our internal world and our thoughts like a scientist observes a test subject. When we think, we're doing. When we think, we're behaving. And that just is what mind is. So next, we'll look at our third and final article for this topic, to an author who argues against behaviorism and will serve as kind of a bridge into functionalism. As always, please ask questions, comments. You can send me an email, you can put a comment here, and I'll see you in the next video lecture.